How did Hitler consolidate or gain more power 1933 to 1934? First thing you need to remember is that when Hitler came to power as Chancellor, there were only 3 Nazis in the entire cabinet. This wasn't a Nazi takeover. This was Hitler being used by other parties, or so they thought, to control Germany. So Hitler has to come in and gain more power for the Nazi party before he can take over the country and run it the way that he wants. So he has a plan. Thing to keep in mind with the rise of the Nazi party, once Hitler is Chancellor, is to think of it as a revolution. He's got to get people out on the streets, he's got to get people mobilised, and he's got to try and shake the whole country up so that he can get as many Nazis and as many Nazi allies into government as possible. There was a lot of violence used during this time. The first thing that Hitler does is he goes to Hindenburg, who's still the president, and says, I want another election. Hindenburg agrees. And Hitler immediately lets the SA loose throughout Germany to use violence against political opponents, and he particularly uses this against communists and social democrats, who are likely to be his strongest opponents. What's different this time? Hitler had done this many times before, sometimes opposed by the police, other times not. What's different this time is that the Nazis have control over many policemen in Germany, particularly the part of Germany called Prussia. Hitler's made sure of this. He's got one of his guys called Frick, F-R-I-C-K, in charge of the police. He's in charge of the Ministry for the Interior. That controlled the police force. So the SA actually came to help the police control the communists. And what that really meant was that the communists, not only would policemen not help communists, not only would policemen not arrest members of the SA, the police would actually join in and help. So this is one of the first things that Hitler does when he calls the new election, unleashes the SA. And then the 27th of February 1933, there's an absolute godsend for Hitler, and that's the Reichstag fire. A Dutch communist called van der Lubbe, he was caught setting fire to the building. Now, the Nazis immediately thought this was a communist takeover, and the evidence is that the Nazis really did genuinely believe that night that the communists were trying to take over the state. There's no evidence at all. We now know that van der Lubbe was acting on his own, and there was no evidence at all of a communist plot. The police at the time said, look, this isn't a communist plot, this is a lone nutcase. It was actually a disaster for the communists, because it was predictable what would happen next. The courts found van der Lubbe on his own guilty. All the other communists who were put on trial were found not guilty. Hitler was furious with this, and this is when Hitler began to say we need people's courts who would swear an oath of loyalty to him. And basically, the people's courts are the beginning of the end of law and order, because what that means is you don't get a fair trial. What it means is whenever you go to trial, the conviction is you're going to be convicted, and the result of the trial is going to be whatever the Nazi party wants it to be. But after van der Lubbe burned down the Reichstag fire decree was passed, and what that said was, listen, we're in a state of war, we're in a state of emergency, the communists are trying to take over, we've got to protect the state. And so it was almost as if terrorists were attacking Germany. That's the way the German people responded. The Communist Party was banned. Even the Social Democrats came under a lot of attack. Their newspapers weren't allowed to publish. They weren't allowed to campaign during the last week. When it comes to the 5th of March 1933, there's the general election, and this is important. Only 44% of the population voted for the Nazis. Now, they won 288 seats in the Reichstag. Even with all the violence, even with the police helping the SA persecute members of the Social Democrats, even with the SA beating up, murdering communists and Social Democrats between them still managed 30% of the vote. So it isn't a case, even in 5th of March 1933, it isn't the case that Hitler is able to win over the majority of the German people to vote for his party. The Germans tended to like Hitler but they didn't like the Nazis. They associated the Nazis with the SA, with violence on the street. They looked at characters like Hermann Goering, who was who became head of the Luftwaffe, and he was seen as a bit of a comical character beside Hitler. This guy was always having affairs, spending huge amounts of money. Robert Ley, who had become the head of the German Labour Front, was a notorious womanizer and a drunk. Germans tended not to like the Nazis, but they did like Hitler. They did like what Hitler stood for, a strong Germany. And so this is one of Hitler's problems. How can he bring the majority of the German people onto his side if he can't bring the majority of the German people to like his party? 23rd March 1933, Hitler brings in something called the Enabling Act. You needed 2/3 of the Reichstag to change the German constitution. Now, the constitution was a set of rules that was set down when the new German state was created after World War II. And the idea was that everybody had to follow these rules. If a government passed a law and the constitution said the law is wrong, that law could be struck off. So to change the constitution, you need a 2/3 majority. This is a problem to Hitler. Hitler could have 60% of the Reichstag and still not be able to change the constitution. He could have 70 or 80% of the Reichstag behind him. But every time he went against the German constitution, every time he went against those big rules, those rules that were set down in stone, those rules that you were not allowed to touch, well, even if he had 70% of the Reichstag, he would have to convince the Reichstag every time he went against the constitution. And that's not the sort of power Hitler was after. Hitler wanted to do what he wanted, when he wanted. Now, one of the things the Reichstag, or the constitution, said was there had to be regular elections. Hitler didn't want that. The constitution said there had to be different political parties. There had to be freedom of speech. You had a right to a fair trial. All these things were in the constitution. Hitler didn't want to be bothered with any of those things. He wanted absolute power. So he wanted something called the Enabling Law, or an Enabling Act, which would basically say, if Hitler wants to change the law, Hitler can change the law. To get that, he needed 2/3 of the Reichstag to vote to bring in this Enabling Act. He didn't have 2/3 majority. Remember, the Nazi Party only won 44%, but another 10% was made up of his allies. He was never going to get that vote on his own. So what he did was quite simple. Ban the communists. Communists aren't allowed to turn up to the Reichstag. Goering was in charge. Hermann Goering was in charge of the Reichstag. He shouted down anybody who tried to disagree with him during debate. And when they voted for this Enabling Act, they made sure that there were lots of SA stormtroopers standing around in brown shirts, looking very angry, looking very hard, and looking at anybody who would even think about disagreeing with Hitler. And funnily enough, given the choice between voting and agreeing with Hitler and giving him this new Enabling Act, or having your head smashed in by a group of SA stormtroopers, most people went along with, let's give Hitler his Enabling Act. The only party that stood against him were the 90 members of the Social Democrats. They voted against the Enabling Act. Of course, those 90 votes couldn't stop Hitler. Hitler was now able to create whatever laws he wanted. And the Social Democrats knew they were doomed anyway. I mean, so they might as well go down with a blaze of glory. Local government was completely reorganised. And this is important because every little area like Prussia or Bavaria, like little local counties within Germany, these were the size of other countries, and they could really create their own little laws within Germany. They had a certain amount of freedom. For example, they had control over their own police forces. Well, by April 1933, that had all gone. It was all under control of the Nazi Party. So by this stage, Hitler can make his own laws. He's got the police under his control. Local governments have been shut down. There's really nobody left within Germany who can really mount any serious opposition to Hitler. He's well on his way to having power. He begins to get rid of the trade unions in May, and that's very important. He begins to bring in his own labour movement. And what that does is, well, there were a lot of people who would have voted Social Democrat because they wanted a good deal for workers. They didn't want workers treated harshly. Now, Social Democrats have a bit of a problem in that there's high unemployment. Well, workers want work. They want factories open. If Hitler can get the factories open, you might be inclined to vote Hitler more than Social Democrat. But when these factories get open, people want a trade union. They want to belong to an organisation that makes sure you've got a fair wage and you won't be sacked, by an unfair boss. And people like the trade unions. So Hitler doesn't just get rid of the trade unions. He brings in his own labour movement. And what that does is that begins to win the workers over to Hitler. They become not his greatest fan, but they're all right with him to begin with. And some of them go over to his side. But it means there's going to be no strikes. People aren't going to come into the street to oppose Hitler. He's got the factories open again. And then he's making efforts to take care of workers. So they tend to think, well, this guy's all right. June 1933, Hitler strikes a deal with the Pope. It's called the Concordat. And that's very important because one of the few remaining large parties in Germany was the Catholic Centre Party. And that was a party that was set up to protect Catholics within Germany. Catholics within Germany had been given a very hard time for a very long time. But they had their own political party, the Centre Party. And that party looked after Catholic rights. Now, the Catholic Party wasn't too fond of Hitler. They viewed Hitler as a bit of a thug. They viewed him as lawless. Catholics didn't like the way that he tended to like people worshipping him. Generally, Catholics like the idea that people should worship God, not Hitler. So the Centre Party is a problem. It might not do as it's told. Hitler wants rid of all political parties. So what he does is he strikes a deal with the Pope, the Concordat. And basically the deal was this: shut the Centre Party down, get rid of the Centre Party, and I'll make sure Roman Catholics aren't persecuted in Germany. That was the deal that the Pope went along with. And so the Catholic Centre Party is shut down. So by July 1933, all political parties are banned. The Centre Party shut itself down. The Social Democratic Party, the Socialists, outlawed. And then there's a law passed for the formation of new parties. There were some parties like the Nationalist Party, which were Nazi allies. They were friendly with the Nazis. They got on quite well with them. They voted with them in the Reichstag. Hitler won't even tolerate those guys. They're not allowed to exist either. You have to shut your party down and become Nazis. And given that they were heavily outnumbered, they decided to go along with that.